when I went to school at the UW, and this was 1971 to 75, you know, there was a lot of turmoil and activism on campus. Protests against the Vietnam War, the rise of ethnic, racial consciousness, the women's movement. When I was at the University of Washington, the Chicano students had risen up and had created all these protests, and there was resignation of a number of staff and professors around issues of ethnic studies. It was a turbulent time. So I was there as a young man in the midst of all this social upheaval, and then obviously you begin to think a little bit about your place in all of this. My parents were still working in very working class jobs. My mother was working in the sewing factories in very difficult kind of work conditions, and my father was working at the restaurant in very similarly difficult conditions. Neither of them had the opportunity for an education, and the amount of money they were working was very minuscule. So in the midst of all this, I'm sort of aware of my own, you know, kind of background, not quite out of all of that, and then trying to figure out, well, so where do I go from here? I'm a child of the restaurants too, and do I, you know, how do I make a transition over to a profession of some kind? Because I don't want to spend the rest of my life waiting on tables for $1 an hour without any benefits or any sick leave or any retirement, but then not quite sure where I'm going to go with all this.
And so what was the pull for you when, I mean, there's the upheaval at the UW, but there are some people when they arrive, they get completely involved, and there are others who, they don't really relate. They're like, it didn't speak to them in some ways.
Well, that's when I developed my interest in journalism and reporting, because to me, it was fascinating to see all of this happening, and then I felt that it would be great to document some of this. So I became involved in the early period of the International Examiner, 1974-75, when the paper was being born, and I felt my role would be best in sort of documenting and being part of this and recording the stories. So I became involved as a reporter at the University of Washington Daily, became involved in a newspaper called Northwest Access, published by a group called Third World People in Communications. It was a minority student kind of organization that was involved in a number of projects. And we represented the first big wave of EOP students, people of color who were moving into the journalism field. I also was involved then in the early years of the International Examiner and its creation. So my life was enmeshed both in participating in and organizing demonstrations, but then trying to remove myself a half step and really prioritizing on documenting and writing about these things. And so that's how I spent first part of my career, first 15 years from college, and then out of college, really as a journalist, documenter, working in the community at that level.